I am a proud young Irishman. In Ulster's hills my life began, a happy boy through green fields ran, and kept God's and man's laws. But when my age was barely 10, my country's wrongs were told again by tens of thousands marching men, and my heart stirred to the cause. So I'll wear no convict.
The book, I suppose, the best way to describe it, and I do describe it, I think, in the preface, is that this is as close as anybody will get to the truth of the full truth of the 1983 mass escape. So it's the best way to describe it. There's a list at the back of the book which is interesting, and I actually got it off Mickey Leggett, who's North Belfast ex-prisoner, who wrote a book from freedom to fetters, from fetters to freedom. And he had listed, and I added to the list a few, but there's escapes, Republican escapes, basically Irish political escapes from jail going back to 1509. So it's a very impressive list. And so they all have their own characters. What I think is, I mostly remember about this is comradeship, because it took people to do their part in this escape. And when it started to go wrong, because the timing went off at the front gate, you got different people assisting. There was a lot of assisting. So, for instance, I mean, and it's really worth mentioning this. See, as well as the escapees, the reason there was 38 is because it was a dangerous escape. We could have actually emptied the whole block. We could have fitted them probably all into the lorry, which was 126 people. But because we knew it was dangerous, because you were escaping to go back into the struggle, anyone who had less than 4 years to do of their sentence was barred. You know, there's no point in them. We decided there should be no point in them going. So that's how you ended up with 38. Now, on the way out, obviously, for that, because this wasn't a period when there was mobile telephones, it wasn't a period where you had radios, you didn't have any other communication. So once the lorry left, the lorry left. The block had to be kept, and the guards who were in the block, which numbered about 24 or 26, had to be held until the wagon or the food wagon actually got out. So that was the rear guard. And these were people, some of whom were only doing weeks, months, and a few years. None of them were doing any long periods. And I suppose if there's, from our point of view, and I tell this obviously from a Republican point of view, the guards have their own point of view, and the prison administration has it, and the British have it, but from a Republican and a prisoner point of view, I think that the rear guard were the heroes of the escape, because they were staying behind. They knew the consequences of an escape. When they acted, they already knew that shots were fired, so they knew that the tension would obviously be even greater than it normally would. And yet they did the business. They took over all the posts that we were holding as escapees to be able to hold them while the lorry would go on out. And they didn't know. There was no way that they had of knowing when to lock up. So the rear guard, wasn't all the prisoners, but it was a substantial number of prisoners. The rest of them were locked up. The rear guard was holding everything, and they had to make sure the first notion that they would get was either hearing the alarm go off, or actually, the British soldiers or the RUC at the time coming in through the gates with the dogs and the weapons and all of that, and they would have been on a big scramble to it. So they were taking a huge risk. And I think that comradeship, which is epitomised in the rear guard, but also during the escape, there was a point at which you went through a number of airlocks. These were where other guards would have been. If the guard had shown any notion, and I was in the front of the cab, so it was really up to me, any notion that they were suspicious, then that guard was getting put into the back of the lorry, and some volunteer was going to give up the escape to take their position to hold it until the lorry went on out. Now, as it turned out, until we hit the Tally Lodge, that didn't happen. Again, in the Tally Lodge, And one of the people who were doing it was a guy called Joe Corey from South Derry. But thankfully for him, I'm sure he was praying on his way through. There was no issue until we got to the front gate. At the front gate, things started to go wrong because of the numbers. There should have only been 6 guards to take there, but because there was a change, they ended up trying the Tally Lodge squad. The squad that were taking the Tally Lodge was the main security building at the front gate. They ended up with something like 40 guards, and they had to hold them all. I think two of them were armed. There was a number of them armed anyway. And 3 guys in the end, once Bobby Story, who was the OC on the day, said, we're going, basically had to do it through sign language, we're going. They knew that they had given up the escape because that at some stage they were going to be overwhelmed, but they held the guards in that hut until we were able to go out through the gate and into the fields. And that was like 3 guys. It was Eddie O'Connor, Dennis Cummings and Rob Kerr, who held that as long as they could, and of course were the first to be arrested and the first to get a terrible beating. And there was revenge beatings after it, vicious beatings, and a lot of the, it came out in court later, and a lot of the prisoners got compensation because of it. Peter Hamilton, who was in the river, there was 4 guys, Peter Hamilton, Bobby Story, Sean McGlinchey and Joe Simpson were caught in the river, and when they were up being sort of, they stripped them and walked them whatever number of hundreds of yards it was up till the bridge, and they were standing there, and one of the Brits said something about I just were lucky or something like that, and Skeet, Peter Hamilton's retort was luck. He says, if I was a duck I would drown, because he had been caught he was actually caught on another escape bid with me, It probably, a lot of it wasn't funny at the time, but when you look back on it, there was interesting ones. I mean, when I was going out, I was holding the driver, because my job was to be in the front cavalry, and I was holding the driver and asking questions and that, and I had to go out. I was the last. I had to get a uniform on because I had been in the front cavalry, but I was the last one to get a uniform on. And when I went out, there was a guard standing outside the door, and I sort of jumped back, taken by surprise, and it turned out to be one of ours, and he was just dressed up. He was to hold the gate, while the rest of us were doing other stuff, and he had put a moustache on. He says, "What do you think, Gerry?" And I says, "You fooled me. I didn't recognise you, or well done, And he looked the part, and he said. He says, "Yeah." He says, "I couldn't get that moustache on." He says, "I had to use super glue." And I says, "Right, no problem." But the story later, because he didn't get out, the story later was it took him 3 weeks to get it off again. So stuff like that, which at a later stage was a bit funny in terms of that. But I suppose at the time there wasn't too many people laughing. There was a psychology of the escape. And to go back to what I said at the start, the atmosphere around this was after 10 comrades had died, and after 5-6 years of protest with systematic brutality. So there was no love lost between captive and captor, and we had to create an atmosphere where we didn't want this to turn into revenge. If the prisoners were taken over, running this block for that period for the escape, then we didn't want anybody treated the way, frankly, prisoners had been treated. So there was the psychology of the escape, which everybody involved in it was given, was very clear. Use verbal aggression, and always be verbally aggressive so that you don't have to use physical aggression. And I mean, there were two guards shot and survived, and a prisoner, Harry Murray, who was shot and survived as well during the escape. But and people can argue with this, especially unionism and the British administration and all of that. But when you think it was in the period of huge conflict, there was no quarter given or taken between Republicans and the British, and yet we managed to get 38 people a mass escape out through what was supposed to be the most secure prison in Europe, and to do it with the minimum of casualties, and certainly on the Republican side, without any revenge at all, then I would have thought that was an achievement as well, because certainly the administration, I've been involved in a number of escape attempts, and I can tell you, as I sit here, it doesn't matter if you do nothing during the escape. If you hide in somebody's trunk and get caught, and therefore there was nothing done during the escape except that, you will still get beaten, because it's par for the course. A prisoner tries to escape, then they will beat you. In this case, there was systematic brutality. See, people have different views of what the escape was, and I think one of the easiest ways of dealing with this, if you like, is to go to your opponents. Now, Sir James Hennessy was the head of British prisons at the time. He was brought in the next day, 26th of September 1983, to start a investigation. He did that fairly rapidly. I think he finished in January. He had something like 118 recommendations. And what he says, because he's no friend of republicanism, I think, is possibly the importance of this quote anyway. And it goes, Sir James Hennessy, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, arrived from England on September the 26th, the day after the escape. He published an 84-page report on his investigation into the escape, which contained 118 conclusions and recommendations. He noted, and I quote from him here, "It should not surprise anyone that an escape, even from a prison such as the Maze, should have been planned and attempted. What is surprising, perhaps, is that it should have succeeded, and in such large measure. Here was a prison designed to contain terrorists, and intended to be the most secure prison in Northern Ireland, with its perimeter breached by no less than 35 prisoners. Viewed in this light, the escape was not merely audacious and daring, it must be judged the most serious escape in the recent history of the United Kingdom prison service." In April 1988, almost 5 years after the escape, 18 of the POWs were sentenced for their part in the escape. Although the RUC and the Public Prosecution Service charged each escapee with 75 individual charges, the Lord Chief Justice took a different view. In his judgment, Lord Larry described the escape as ingeniously planned and cleverly executed, and as being not a clandestine flight but a walkout, or more accurately, a drive-out in broad daylight. He slammed the evidence given by the guards as contradictory, inaccurate, and as being motivated in many cases by a wish to conceal failures on the part of the individual guards. He described the guards' perception of what had happened on the day of the escape as a humiliating experience they would prefer to forget. None of the H7 rearguard were ever identified or charged. In later court actions taken, many of the recaptured escapees received compensation for the injuries received in the aftermath of the September 25th, 1983. Indeed, many more of the non-escapees left in H7 that day, who had been viciously beaten by the guards and bitten by their dogs, also received compensation. No guards were ever charged in connection with any of the assaults. Warder John Adams returned to work. Campbell Courtney also returned to work and was later head of security in a private firm which managed the H blocks after they were decommissioned.
Each blocks Black Cromwell lives, while Mason stalks, the bully taunts the brave. But I'll wear no convict uniform, nor meekly serve my time, that Britain might brand Ireland's fight 800 years of crime. Does Britain need 1,000 years of protest, riot, death and tears? Or will this past decade of fears of 80 decades spell an end to Ireland's agony, new hope for human dignity, and will the last obscenity be the spring each block sell. But I'll wear no convict's uniform, nor meekly serve my time, that Britain might brand Ireland's fight 800 years of pride.
It always seems impossible until it's done.